Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video. This topic is called VIP friendship. I'm going to be starting with a phrase that you're probably familiar with, and it says, I can count my friends on the fingers of my hand. That means that we have very little friends, right? Alright, so if I ask you how many friends do you have, what will you reply to me? Do you have 5, 10, 1, 30? What if I ask your Facebook page, how many friends do you have? 500, 100, 600, 5,000? But I want you to analyze this. Out of that number, how many are your true friends? All right, so we all have friends that are loyal, that are, if you ask them for a favor and if you need them for something, they immediately respond to you, because they're true friends. And the other way around, we have friends that only search us when they need something, when it's convenient, every once in a year because they need money, they're in trouble. But other than that, they never call to see how you're doing. So we have good friends and then we have friends, right? All right. So the same happens with God. Throughout the history, there have been men and women who have that the Bible describes as faithful servants, or people that have been called God's friends. I'm going to be naming a few: Noah, Job, Elijah, John, Mary, which is Lazarus' sister, among others. But the friendship that I'm going to be talking to you today is the friendship that God had with Abraham. Abraham is considered the father of faith. God called him his friend because of that, because every time that God would give Abraham an instruction, Abraham would obey. He would never ask, oh, what benefit do I get from this? Or, oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy. No, he would always obey. So God would give the instruction and then Abraham would do it immediately. For example, God told him to move from a different city. Abraham at that time was living in a stable place. He had a good income, he had properties, he owned a lot of things. And then the Lord said, move, I'm gonna tell you where to go, just leave this place. And Abraham, without asking, obeyed. So what do you think would happen if God would ask us to do that? Do you think that we would do that, to step outside of our comfort zone and do what God is asking us to do? What would happen? All right, so I'm going to be mentioning the part of the Bible that quotes this. It's actually Hebrews 11:8, and it says, it was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and to go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. So Abraham had no information, he only had an instruction, and he had the willing to obey what God asked him to do. All right, so as I mentioned in another video, Abraham and Sarah were not able to conceive kids because Sarah was sterile. So, however, God promised Abraham that he was going to be the father of many nations. This is in Genesis 17:4-16. And after 25 years, Abraham and Sarah were able to conceive that child that God had promised to them. So further along in the story, when Isaac was born, God tested Abraham again, because he knew that he was faithful and that he was going to do whatever he commanded him to do. So he asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, because God knew that Abraham was going to obey him. So Abraham did not hesitate or disobey or became sad. He actually was on his way to sacrifice his son. And when he was going to do it, what happened is that an angel from God showed up and told him not to do it, because they saw that he was a very faithful person, that he was going to obey God. So instead of sacrificing his son, he gave a little lamb that was close to them. You can find that in Genesis 22, 118. I'm just sharing it very briefly, but you can read on your own. So see how Abraham acted with God. Every time that he had an instruction, he obeyed. That is why God called him his friend, because he was living by faith. He was an obedient person. He was humble, and he would always believe God. The difference nowadays, God asks us to trust him. I'm sorry, he says, give me 10% so that I can bless your 90%. And then people go nuts. It's like, I'm sorry, what? 10% of what I'm earning? That is a lot of money. I am not going to do that. You think I'm going to give my money to some religious leader? Oh, absolutely not. And then what happens is that the people that are not trusting God are living in scarcity. The money is never enough for them because they really don't see God's blessing, because they're not obeying God. Right? So, okay. Moving on. What happens is that every time that people don't trust God, they're trusting their resources instead of God's promises. I'm going to give you an example. There is a restaurant in the U.S. called Chick-fil-A. The owner, which is the founder, is a Christian man. One of the main things that this restaurant has is that they do not work on Sunday. He was very clear from the beginning that he was going to obey and not work on Sundays, because scripture says not to work on Sundays. So he was like, no one in one single store is going to open on Sunday. He was very clear in that, and people were like, have you lost your mind? Sundays are the best days to sell because families gather together. And he was like, you know what, I'm just going to obey. I don't have the exact information, but I read once on the internet that they gave numbers, real numbers of how much money Chick-fil-A is making versus Burger King or Kentucky. I'm going to make the numbers up because I don't remember them exactly, but Chick-fil-A, without working on Sundays, are selling around $150 million versus companies that work on Sundays, thinking that they're going to be making more money, are actually making around $80 million. So this is just an example of how obedience and faith and a VIP friendship with God can give you as a blessing or as a benefit, because you're trusting God and you're obeying him. All right? So if you go to the Bible and read, let me see, James 2:23, it says, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. There are more verses that are actually saying that Abraham was God's friend. If you go to Acts 3:13, it says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers. So God is calling himself the God of Abraham, right? If you go to Exodus 3:6, it says, then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God keeps calling himself that he is the God of Abraham because he was his friend. So the difference that we have, humans versus human, in terms of friendship is that us as humans, we only see the appearance. We can see someone and think that he's a nice person, very loyal, very polite. But the reality is that we don't know their heart. And sometimes, boom, surprise, a person that we thought was very good as a human being, then all of a sudden it's completely different. And that's the difference. God knows the heart. He does not see the outside. He sees the heart of each person. An example that is very clear about this topic that I'm mentioning right now is Judas. The story that I'm going to be reading to you is in John 12. From 3 to 8, I'm going to be reading it for you, and it says, then Mary took about a pin of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But no one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Imagine if we were listening to the conversation between Jesus and Judas, and we listened to Judas saying that he was going to give the money to the poor, maybe we would have thought, oh, what a good person, what a generous heart, he's interested in giving the poor. Let me hit him with a like, because wow, how good. Apparently on the outside he was being good because he wanted to give to the poor, but in his heart that was not true. What he was thinking is that, oh, what a waste, I could have used that money for something else, because he was a thief, right? Okay, further along in scripture you can find this in John 13:18. I am not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. He was talking about the betrayal that Judas did to Jesus. They were together for a long time, but at the end of the day, Judas's heart was wrong. He didn't care about Jesus, and he ended up selling him. Okay, so that's the difference. We see the outside, God sees the heart. That's the difference. The friendship that God had with Abraham is that Abraham was a good person, his heart was pure, he served God, he was obedient. And then the other friendship, Judas was a follower, he was serving God apparently, and then it turned out to be a complete betrayal. So I have a question for you. What is the type of friendship that you have with God? Actually, do you have a relationship with God? What would happen if God would sit down with someone and start talking about you? What would he say? Would he say, oh, this guy only comes to me whenever he wants something? Or would he very happy and proud and be like, oh, this guy's amazing, he's such a good obedient person, every time that I say do something, he does it? How would it be? Would it be a good reference to you, or would it be like, oh God, because God knows our thoughts, he knows how we treat people, he knows the way that we live our lives, basically. So that is something that I want you to analyze, that what would he say about, how you live your life. So this is a topic for this week. I really want you to have this topic that I just told you as a reflection for this week, to think about it. I really hope that you enjoyed this week's video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a blessed day, everyone. God bless.